everybody, Ty here. I hope everyone's doing well. So, in case you missed it, we did a live discussion yesterday discussing the Sunday and Monday severe weather threats, and there have been a few changes with that, which of course we're going to discuss. But we also now have a Saturday slight risk that's been issued in addition to the sequence for Sunday and Monday here. Then also the weather pattern as a whole. We didn't really go over that quite as much as I felt like we should have. So that's what this video is going to be here today. Make sure you guys, of course, are hitting that like button and hitting that subscribe button as well, because it does look like the weather pattern is taking a more active turn. In case anyone hasn't been watching the videos since, I would say, earlier part of this week, we did have originally two outcomes here where we were going to end up having a death ridge over the central part of the U.S., which was going to basically kind of slow down the severe weather threat, almost dare say even shut it down to a point, at least over the plains. Over towards the Ohio Valley still looked like a point of interest potentially, and then maybe over towards the Northwest as a whole. That, of course, has since changed. But, of course, we still had to get through this week. But we've kind of gone the other way now, and we're looking like we're going to maintain a pretty active storm pattern over the central and, of course, the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, and maybe even the deep south now being included in our areas of concern in the future. But for right now, though, this is the latest on our Saturday risk here. This is our probabilistic area. We do have a hatched risk on the southern end of that slight risk here. So I'm thinking that at the very least, this is most likely going to be for hail. These storms are most likely going to be elevated at this point in time as that trough begins to really deepen. As that trough begins to deepen, that's when we start to get that Saturday and the Sunday and Monday threat here. Still thinking of the Pi Day weekend. But in any case, though, we have the hail threat here. There is a chance of a few severe wind gusts and maybe a tornado or two for this setup here. But the days where all hazards seem to be possible really seem to be in the day 4 to 5 time frame here. These are pretty large areas, so there's going to be a lot of ground being covered in these regions as we go into the weekend and into the start of next week as well. So we'll have to be watchful of areas such as Dallas, all the way over towards maybe even just north of Louisiana as far as Sunday is concerned. And then areas as far north as maybe right outside of Cleveland, Ohio even. So all the way through the Ohio Valley, Midwest, Ozarks, and even the deep south. Just on Sunday alone, we have, I would say, about 471,000 square miles plus. Actually, I would round that up to 472 based off what I'm seeing here. And almost 51 million people under the gun here for severe weather just on Sunday alone. Then we have the subsequent threat on Monday to go along with that. Even more people are at risk at this point, which would be about 63 million in an area that's about 390,000 square miles. So, like I said, a lot of ground being covered here over the next few days. Areas as far north as Philadelphia, all the way as far south as even Jacksonville, Florida, could be a point of interest for severe weather. At this point, I would expect more of a linear threat in the northern sector of this slight risk here, but in the southern sector, I do think there could be some potential for all hazards being possible. Once again, do think the hail threat will be the first to downtrend out of all three of the hazards in the sequence here. So, of course, as we all know, when we get into the model data here, we often like to compare models. So you're, of course, bottom left corner of the screen. So make sure you're paying close attention to both of these models, because there's been a lot of discrepancy, and that has unfortunately continued. So I don't have a whole lot in the way of clarity in regards to this forecast. I can't really say anything with my chest, so to speak, that we have a particular area where we could see like a potential uptrend. However, I do think that at some point we may very well get an enhanced risk issued before all is said and done, especially as we get within the 72-hour range. Also, one thing I want to make mention of before we go into the model data here is as we look at that day 4 outlook. Okay, there we go, because it didn't seem like it wanted to move. But as we go into that day 4 outlook here, as we transition to day 3, some of these areas up to the north off towards the west could downtrend to a marginal risk as well. So this look that we're seeing now is still pretty variable at this point as well. I would say that areas further towards the south, towards Houston, also could end up in a marginal risk as well. So it could be an expansion or a little bit of a shrinking of this area before all is said and done. Now that we got that out the way, let's go ahead and get to the model data. So here is a look at the GFS. As we mentioned before, euros on the bottom left corner of the screen. We're going to go ahead and move forward here. And one thing to pay attention to are these little short wave troughs. These are going to be more prominent towards the mid levels of the atmosphere, more so than the upper levels. But we'll see even a chance for severe weather as we head into Friday. Then as we get into Saturday, this is our main event here. This trough here is going to be the start of it all. This first trough comes through, not a very impressive one at that. Like I said, it's a lot more mid-level influenced, I would say, at this point. But nonetheless, as a result, we could still be watchful of severe weather over here. As we mentioned before, it was really going to be over towards east central Kansas, maybe northeastern parts of Oklahoma, where we have that threat for mostly, I would say at this point, large hail. A lot of these storms, I would expect them to be pretty well elevated. When it comes to the tornado threat, you want the cloud bases to be a little bit closer towards the surface here. Now, as we continue to go into Sunday, this is where we start to get that little reinforcing trough here beginning to come into play here. You can also tell that the trough's evolving by this little jet streak that's popped up here, or is trying to pop up. I don't think it fully matures. I don't think it makes its way to being a fully realized jet streak here. Like I said, I really think a lot of this is going to be mid-level influence versus upper levels. Right now, of course, we're looking at the upper levels of the atmosphere, as I mentioned before, but either way, we do have a pretty substantial trough at this point. We'll have short waves coming in around this time frame as well in the mid-levels, and this is what's going to help influence and kind of initiate our severe weather as a whole here, which of course we'll be stuck with as we get into the latter half of the day. Storms could very well fire maybe even as early as maybe mid to even early afternoon. And then of course we have the subsequent threat that gets into the overnight here for the deep south. I mainly would expect this mode to be kind of a linear event until we get further towards the south. The biggest inhibiting factor, I think, for this southern mode as we go later into the day for Monday might have more to do with forcing than anything else, and maybe some limited instability. But it does look like we have just enough to, at the very least, get a strong line of storms. As far as supercells go, it's a little bit more hit or miss, I would say. Now, as we go further into range here, I want you to pay attention to these other troughs that are going to be coming into play as well. I don't even think that our winter weather threat really is over either at this point. Looks like we do get a little bit of cold air trying to sneak in here. So there could be a chance that we get some remnant snow on the backside of this system at this juncture. But like I said, at this point, it's still kind of hard to tell. We're a little bit closer towards that 150-hour time frame, and things become really variable by that point and beyond. But you can see a much more stout trough beginning to come into play. This is actually a great definition of a jet streak that's evolving. Notice how it's on the left side of this trough here, and watch as I continue to move this forward how it eventually starts to push off to the right, slowly but surely. Then as that happens, then the trough weakens. But around here towards the Tennessee and Ohio valleys, maybe could be another chance of severe weather as we get into midweek next week. Then as we go into the following sequence here, you see yet another trough beginning to come into play here. It's just starting to get past the Rockies here and heading into the Midwest. So this could be some traditional tornado alley setups coming into play here. Obviously at this range, it's kind of hard to tell just what exactly will come of this. But this is the first signs of a trend, maybe even a signal beginning to pop up here at this point. Eventually, we do start to get some pretty strong ridging out towards the west, and then this starts to favor a setup that would lean into much more activity over towards the Great Lakes and my brain isn't working, Ohio Valley region as a whole here, as we get into the middle part of April. But just as we saw earlier on, we had this showing up on GFS, and then it went the other way. The Euro was the one that was showing an active storm track to begin with. And as you can see on the Euro here, that we kind of have a very similar look here. The Euro's kind of maintained its shape here in regards to the overall pattern as we get into April here. and it looks like it continues to show a lot more in the way of aggression in regards to the storm track as we go into the future. So going to be really interesting to see what lies ahead here. April could be a pretty active month, or it could be a little bit on the quieter side of things. So from this point onward here, probably for the rest of the week even, I would say, we're going to put a lot more of our focus on the severe weather threat for this weekend. So, of course, with the large slight risk area, I do, of course, think that there is a pretty good chance that we'll get into a enhanced risk. I don't know if we'll go anything beyond that as of right now. There are some pretty solid parameters here, but there are also quite a few fail parameters that go along with it. So, with that in mind, we're going to just kind of be as comprehensive as we can and go over as much as we can without making this too long of a video for you guys. If we were to make our comparison with the Euro and the GFS here, one thing I've made note of is GFS is starting to get a little bit more aggressive with the storm initiation than what I've been seeing off of its previous runs here. These short waves that we're looking at the 700 millibar level, mid levels of the atmosphere that I mentioned earlier, it does look like by early afternoon we get a little bit of activity over here towards Arkansas, at least on both of these runs. Texas is also another point of interest, with the Euro kind of being a little bit more prominent towards that region. Of course, as we get later into the evening, as we get that jet stream to even deepen, especially get past sunset here, this is where we start to get that linear mode to begin to kick in here. And overnight, over towards Mississippi and Alabama, I think that's when we'll have our greatest storm coverage. However, questions remain with that in regards to instability. The kinematics are good, so I would say that if we can maintain some level of cape over towards this region, given the decent kinematics that we have here, damaging winds and tornadoes will probably be the dominant threat. However, it would still be a pretty conditional threat at this juncture. So we go further along, what you'll make note of is we see another prominent shortwave take shape over towards the maybe even the Atlanta metro area and areas further off towards west central Georgia and east central Alabama, heading to the south here. So the storm component definitely looks like we might be dealing with a southeasterly motion here. We'll have to see if that ends up panning out or not. But one thing that I've made note of also is that we get a secondary shortwave that pops up over here towards South Georgia as we get later into the early afternoon and evening hours. So with this in mind here, like I said, if we can get any sort of prefrontal cells, I do think there's a conditional tornado threat here to go along with it. There could maybe even be 2 rounds up towards the northern sector, but like I said, I'm really uncertain as to what lies ahead for the region there. We'll go back a couple frames here because obviously the southeast isn't the only area of interest at this point. What we'll be also watching is this area off towards the mid-Atlantic and even into the northeast at this point. We do see some signs of a shortwave as far north as the DC and even the Philly area, which were areas that we did see in that slight risk earlier, along with South Carolina and North Carolina. I would say that South Carolina has probably one of the more prominent shortwaves out of the bunch here that I've just mentioned. But we do see something kind of popping up here, maybe over here towards the Maryland region as well here. So the Delmarva needs to be watched really closely as we go through the early afternoon and into the evening hours, I would say, at this point. By this point, I would expect these storms to be quick movers. So once we get further into the evening, I wouldn't have a whole lot of concern left over. I think a lot of the energy at this point will also be used up from this storm system as a whole. Once we get into the evening overnight hours, I would expect some high winds. These would not be thunderstorm related winds, but we would also have some strong winds left over from the storm system. And by the time we get into Tuesday, we're looking for much better weather conditions as we go forward here. So looking at the low level jet, this is where things really start to pique my interest here. I've been talking about the quad state region as a whole here in regards to the tornado threat for Sunday. And it looks like for the most part, as far as the wind profile is concerned, I definitely am kind of backing that based off what I've been seeing off the GFS and the Euro as a whole here. GFS has been a little bit more aggressive with the outcomes here versus the Euro, but Euro as of late has been slightly uptrending as we get later into the evening over towards the Tennessee Valley here, and maybe even into the southeast as well. So it's a lot to keep track of. The timing of this event is really going to be crucial. The timing of this trough is really going to be a big determining factor here, and also convective mode, because it could be a nocturnal event as far as the severe weather is concerned, maybe even the tornado threat to go along with it. And obviously, we've seen what nocturnal tornadoes have been doing lately. So, less than ideal situation if that were to occur. Now, as we get into the day on Monday here, this definitely has the look of a linear event based off of what I'm seeing on the low-level jet here. You can almost see a shining example of that. You see the short wave that pops up here, and you can see it almost kind of moving along a boundary here. This is likely going to be the cold front, as we mentioned before. And that look kind of is maintained here on the Euro along with the GFS here. The shape of that linear mode looks a tad bit different, so that could alter the storm motion just a little bit. But I would say if we were to be watching for any kind of tornado threat, I would say that the Euro might be a tad bit better in regards to the directional shear, whereas the speed shear might be a little bit more prominent on the GFS. So this is kind of what I've been talking about in regards to the discrepancy between these models. The timings are different, and then also the wind profiles themselves are varying just ever so slightly here. And it's those minute changes that could make a world of difference in regards to who gets what. So, like I said, not really able to hammer down just who exactly I would be the most concerned with towards this region in the south. Up towards the north, I would expect more of a linear mode, definitely leaning into a damaging wind threat more so than anything else. There are some pockets where we do get some decent low-level jets, so it's not like a tornado can be ruled out towards this region, but I do think the threat is going to be lower. I think instability might be the biggest limiting factor towards this region here. There is a good wind profile, however, on the Euro as we head over towards the but the Philly area and over towards DC. I don't know how I got those two mixed up. But once again, just like we mentioned before when we were looking at the mid-levels, once we get later into the evening and into the overnight, the storm threat should be dying down. So I'm going to go over to the dew points here. No real point in showing the Euro here, because the GFS and the Euro have been in good agreement about this. There is going to be an abundant warm sector and a moisture profile for this region here in regards to the Sunday and the Monday threat here. In fact, some of the richer dew points is going to be into the latter half of the evening here, which does lead to some increased concern. But this is where that convective mode kind of comes into play here. If the forcing isn't too strong, there's still a chance that we could get some overnight supercells here. GFS kind of favors that a little bit more from what we were seeing on that 500 millibar profile. But if we were to get over convection, this mode could fail over here towards the deep south as we get later into the evening. The northern mode, I think the forcing is a tiny bit better, because this is where the lowest central pressure of the trough is going to end up being. Wherever that low ends up being, usually the forcing ends up being stronger, so we have to always be watchful of that region. Now, as we get into Monday, I'm thinking over here toward, like I said, I really think the Atlanta area and parts of central Birmingham might be the point of interest here in regards to that tornado threat. Again, I think damaging winds are going to be the main threat towards this region here, as well as the one up north. But I'm not sure if I'm really sold on the potential for supercells in the southern mode just yet. But up towards the north here, we do have a good kinematic profile here as well, and that I need to make sure that that's not lost on anyone's account here. So we have to be watchful for, of course, at least two modes of severe weather. The third mode, hail, might be more feasible towards this region than I would say down south at this point too. So we're going to go ahead now and get a look at that instability, and this is where we bring the Euro back into the equation here. And what we'll be watching most intensely here at this point is right before the 30th here. We're actually even going to take a look at Saturday as well, because like I said, even though I would expect the storms to be elevated towards Kansas, Oklahoma, and maybe even Missouri, we do get some pretty good instability readings here. The mixed layer cape in particular looks really good over towards this region. Surface cape is a little bit more subpar, but still more than sufficient enough to prompt some severe weather given the other ingredients that we have in play here. But as we get into Sunday, this is where we start to get our most unstable environment for the weekend, I would say. And this is why I think that Sunday probably will be the most prolific of the 3 days potentially. Like I said, that's not really a guarantee, obviously, but I'm seeing some pretty impressive cape readings where we're even getting up to about 3,000 joules per kilogram on both GFS and Euro during differing times, of course, but still, in these environments, we have to be very watchful of what we may have before us here. Thankfully, during this time, based off the sounding that I've just clicked here, it's just outside of the delta here, the Mississippi Delta here between Louisiana and the Mississippi border, the kinematics are not that strong at this point in time. We were to go ahead and move this a couple hours, like let's say about 3 to 6 hours later, we start to get a little bit of an uptrend here, especially as we get right towards that sunset time frame where the low level jet really starts to kick in. You can see that we've gone from that marginal tornado threat to a probable tornado threat here. This does not mean that you're guaranteed a tornado towards this region, but definitely something that you're going to have to still be watchful of. So whether it's the GFS or the Euro, we're seeing a unanimous look here in regards to the amount of energy available here. Seems like there's going to be plenty of instability as we get into Sunday evening. Again, Sunday night really seems to be the point where I'm kind of scratching my head a little bit here still. We do have some instability, like don't get me wrong, but usually for me personally, I try to look for areas that are at about 1,000 joules per kilogram in Cape. These areas here are starting to drop below that at this point because of that lack of daytime heating that we would have. So as a result, we're kind of seeing that little bit of a drop off here. We do end up seeing a resurgence as we head into Monday, however. So, and this again, as I mentioned before, really seems to be most prominent around south central Georgia, southern Alabama, and the Florida panhandles here. Regions further towards the north, it seems like we have better mixed layer cape than we do surface cape. If we could get decent surface cape here, there's always a chance that you have a higher chance for spin ups here. But I'm thinking, given everything that we have available over towards the south, that's where the wind profile and the thermodynamics, instability, dew points, etc., all of that comes together better towards this region. So one other thing I'm going to address here, and I don't always look at this, but considering what I was seeing yesterday during the live discussion, I did see a lot in the way of convective inhibition, or CIN here, as you can see on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at what's available here, or what kind of inhibition we might be up against for these storms in regards to Sunday in particular. Another reason why I also think that Saturday itself might not be a big day is because of this very reason here. We don't have a super strong layer of inhibition here towards the surface, but it's enough to hamper potential for tornado threat here. Like I said, the other parameters are in place, but because of that inhibition, look at what ends up happening here. Storm threat just doesn't really look like it manifests here. And then if you were to look at these two features here, the LFC, which is lift-free condensation, and the LCL region, you want these to be a little bit lower to the ground if you're looking for a tornado threat. So you can already tell that if there any storms were to form in this environment, that these storms would have elevated cloud bases. Not that you can't get tornadoes from that, but it's a little bit more challenging for that to occur. So as we get into Sunday here, it seems like we do have a little bit in inhibition, but it's kind of spread out here. The Euro was the one that I was looking at the yesterday, where we had the higher level of CIN available. So it looks like a cap does try to end up being in place over here towards the quad state region. This could make or break the severe weather setup here, because with enough forcing, this cap can break, and then we could get widespread severe storms. But if we get little holes here and there, that's when I would think that could really help that tornado threat take off. because when you look for those discrete cells, you don't want an oversaturation of convection. It's kind of the opposite. You want storms kind of pop up here and there so they have the room to grow and mature. Whereas with the GFS, it's looking kind of more like it's open season at this point. So we get into Monday, we'll see, of course, that inhibition dropping off. Usually that happens once we get the frontal boundary to move through here. So once that cold front kicks in, inhibition's really not going to be much of an issue anymore. Euro's kind of leaning a little bit against that still at this point, but even so, inhibition drops off significantly in comparison to Sunday for that map. But let's go ahead and lastly take a look at what our precip types might be for this entire weather pattern as a whole here. If you guys are still with me, definitely say something in the comments. But here is the GFS here. We still have some pretty active weather out ahead of our main event, of course, as we know. Still have some decent snow also over here towards the Dakotas here in northern Nebraska. And then as we watch that go out of the region here, this is where our severe weather threat begins to kick in. And then you can see that line beginning to form on Monday. And as that clears out, weather starts to calm down briefly. And it's a brief reprieve, but then we get yet another storm system coming in with potential severe weather, maybe in two different modes here. Maybe towards the Ohio Valley and then over towards the deep south and southeast. Then we have another system falling in right behind that. This is where we start to see a little bit more favoritism towards the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region. And then the Midwest as well as we go through this entire model run here. Of course, looking at the Euro, it's pretty similar as to what we saw starting out with the GFS. We have the 30th and 31st as our main days here. I find it very interesting to note that we still have those line segments that I was seeing yesterday. Euro's kind of leaning a little bit more towards those line segments with increased wind damage potential here. Whenever you see these little backward C-shape, those are often more referred to as like bow echoes, so to speak. We end up seeing a lot of that. And then as we get into Monday afternoon, what I'm also paying extra close attention to is this little pocket right here towards west central, southern, and central Georgia here, where maybe some supercell potential is possible. Of course, over here towards the northeast, as we mentioned before, looking at mostly a linear mode here, but I do see a little bit of a breakdown over here as well. Just make sure that we're seeing that right. We're going to make our little comparison here on GFS to go along with it. For the most part, though, I do think GFS is kind of leaning more towards just a full-on linear mode with some maybe a couple of embedded cells in there as well. So like I said, both of these regions, regardless of where we go, we're going to have to watch that with extreme interest here. And of course, here's the Euro. Here's that other setup towards the second that I'm interested in as well. And this looks like this is going to be lingering for a while. So according to the Euro, it could be another multi-day event here as we go into next week as well. So a lot that we're going to be covering here on the channel. Also see a pretty significant Eastern Rockies winter event based off of this look here. Stark comparison to what we were seeing with the GFS. And this is where forecasting can sometimes become a headache when you have two models that are very good. I would go as far as to say that they're premier at this point, and I think a lot of you would agree as well, because usually between one of these two models is where we often find our outcome. Not always, but more often than not. But as you can see here, Euro is very, very active, and then also a big cold spat is even forecasted on here as we get later into the month. This first part of the month of April here. This 540 line, by the way, is our 32-degree line, and you can see how far south that ends up pushing. So find it rather interesting to see that at the end of the run here. Like I said, stark comparison to the GFS, where we have a lot more ridging expected out towards the west, and a ridge that kind of stays a little bit, and the crest of that ridge stays a little bit further off towards the west, and we see more dipping down a little bit further off towards the east. Not much in the way of troughing expected towards the southeast. So, tale of two models once again. This is going to be very interesting and very tedious little stretch of weather here that we're going to be looking into as we continue to go forward. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. By the way, I know this one ran a little bit long. Make sure you guys are hitting that like button and hitting that subscribe button. Of course, tomorrow we're going to put a lot more of our focus on this weekend setup here. But until then, you guys take care. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and I will see you soon. Have a good night.